Behind every dictator lies a trail of personal destruction that extends far beyond the battlefield. While history remembers Benito Mussolini as the architect of Italian fascism, few know the devastating price paid by the women who loved him. Their stories reveal a pattern of abandonment, betrayal, and tragedy that would span decades and claim multiple lives. These women trusted a man who would ultimately sacrifice everything and everyone for power, including those closest to him. What happened to them is a testament to how absolute power corrupts not just nations, but the most intimate human relationships. Today, we uncover the forgotten stories of three women whose lives were forever altered by their connection to one of history's most notorious leaders. Their fates would prove that loving a dictator comes with a price that extends far beyond the grave. Long before Mussolini became the face of Italian fascism, there was Ida Dalser. A successful businesswoman from Trentino, Ida owned a beauty salon in Milan and possessed both financial independence and striking beauty. When she met the young socialist journalist Benito Mussolini in 1909, neither could have imagined how their passionate affair would end in institutional confinement and a systematic erasure from history. Ida was immediately captivated by Mussolini's charisma and revolutionary fervor. Unlike many women of her era, she had her own money and could support his early political ambitions. When Mussolini struggled financially with his newspaper, Il Popolo d'Italia, Ida sold her salon and provided the funds that kept his publication alive. She believed in his vision and invested not just her money, but her entire future in the man she loved. In 1914, Ida gave birth to a son she named Benito Albino Mussolini. She claimed that she and Mussolini had married in a civil ceremony, though documentation of this union would later become a source of controversy. What cannot be disputed is that she lived as his wife and that he acknowledged the child as his son. For a brief period, they formed what appeared to be a genuine family unit. However, Mussolini's ambition soon outgrew his personal commitments. When World War I began, he enlisted in the military, leaving Ida and their infant son behind. During his service, he began a relationship with Rachele Guidi, a woman from a more modest background who would better suit his evolving political image. When he married Rachele in 1915, Ida's world collapsed. Ida refused to accept abandonment quietly. She publicly claimed her status as Mussolini's first wife and demanded recognition for their son. She appeared at political rallies, wrote letters to newspapers, and confronted Mussolini directly about his obligations to their family. Her persistence became an increasing embarrassment to Mussolini as his political star rose. As Mussolini consolidated power in the early 1920s, Ida's protests became more than just a personal inconvenience. They represented a political liability. A dictator building a cult of personality around traditional family values could not afford to have an abandoned first family making public appeals for recognition. The state apparatus that Mussolini controlled would soon turn its attention to silencing Ida permanently. In 1926, Ida was arrested on charges of disturbing the peace and making false claims about her marital status. However, instead of a brief detention, she was declared mentally unstable and committed to a psychiatric facility in Venice. The diagnosis was convenient for Mussolini. It discredited her claims while removing her from public view. Her son Benito Albino was also institutionalized, despite showing no signs of mental illness. The conditions Ida faced in the asylum were deliberately harsh. She was kept in isolation, denied visitors, and subjected to treatments that were designed more to break her spirit than heal any supposed mental ailment. Guards were instructed to prevent any communication with the outside world. Her letters were confiscated, and any attempts to contact journalists or political figures were blocked. For 11 years, Ida remained confined in various psychiatric institutions throughout Italy. She never stopped declaring her love for Mussolini or her belief that he would eventually come to rescue her and their son. She maintained detailed journals documenting her treatment and continued to insist on her rightful place as his first wife. These writings would later provide historians with a chilling account of how the fascist state dealt with inconvenient personal relationships. In 1937, after more than a decade of confinement, Ida Dalser died in the San Clemente Psychiatric Hospital in Venice. The official cause was listed as brain hemorrhage, though the circumstances surrounding her death raised questions that were never properly investigated. She was buried in an unmarked grave, with no family members present and no public acknowledgement of her passing. Her son, Benito Albino, suffered a similar fate. After being declared mentally incompetent despite evident intelligence and stability, he was moved between various institutions. He repeatedly attempted to contact his father and assert his rightful place in the Mussolini family. In 1942, at the age of 26, he died in a psychiatric hospital in Milan. Like his mother, he was buried without ceremony or recognition. The systematic destruction of Ida Dalser and her son represents one of the most personal examples of fascist brutality, but her story was just the beginning of a pattern that would define Mussolini's relationships with women throughout his rise and fall from power. While Ida Dalser was being erased from history, Rachele Guidi was being positioned as the ideal fascist wife. Born into a working-class family in Predoppio, the same village as Mussolini, Rachele represented the humble origins and traditional values that the fascist movement sought to promote. Her marriage to Mussolini in 1915 marked the beginning of a relationship that would span 3 decades and produce 5 children. Rachele's early life was marked by hardship and limited education. She worked as a domestic servant before catching Mussolini's attention in her late teens. Unlike Ida, who brought financial resources and business acumen to the relationship, Rachele offered something different: complete loyalty and an unwavering acceptance of her subordinate role in Mussolini's life. Their civil marriage ceremony in 1915 was a modest affair, reflecting their limited means at the time. Rachele was pregnant with their first child, Etta, and the marriage served both personal and practical purposes. As Mussolini's political ambitions grew, Rachele adapted to her role as a political wife, though she never fully embraced the public aspects of her position. Throughout the 1920s, as Mussolini rose to power, Rachele remained largely in the background. She preferred domestic life and showed little interest in the political machinations that consumed her husband's attention. This suited Mussolini perfectly, as it allowed him to present an image of traditional family values while pursuing his political and personal interests elsewhere. Rachele bore Mussolini 4 more children: Vittorio, Bruno, Romano, and Anna Maria. She devoted herself entirely to their upbringing, while Mussolini became increasingly absorbed in governing Italy and building his personal empire. The family lived in relative comfort, benefiting from Mussolini's position, but Rachele herself remained largely removed from the corridors of power. The couple underwent a religious wedding ceremony in 1925, after Mussolini signed the Lateran Treaty with the Catholic Church. This second ceremony was designed to strengthen Mussolini's relationship with the Church and present his family as a model of Catholic values. For Rachele, it represented a form of validation, though she remained aware of her husband's numerous extramarital affairs. Rachele's knowledge of Mussolini's infidelities created a constant tension in their marriage. She was particularly aware of his relationship with Clara Petacci, which began in the 1930s and would continue until his death. However, Rachele's position as the official wife provided her with a certain security, even as she struggled with the emotional cost of her husband's betrayals. As World War II progressed and Mussolini's regime began to crumble, Rachele found herself increasingly isolated. The comfortable life she had known for decades began to dissolve as military defeats mounted and public support for fascism collapsed. She watched her sons become involved in the war effort, with her son Bruno dying in a military aviation accident in 1941. The final years of Mussolini's regime brought particular hardship for Rachele. As Allied forces advanced through Italy and opposition to Mussolini intensified, she faced the constant threat of capture or retaliation. The family was forced to move frequently, never knowing when they might need to flee again. When Mussolini was arrested in July 1943, Rachele's world collapsed entirely. She was left to care for their remaining children, while her husband was imprisoned and then rescued by German forces. During the period of the Italian Social Republic, she lived in constant fear, knowing that her husband's desperate attempt to maintain power was doomed to failure. Following Mussolini's death in 1945, Rachele faced immediate threats from partisan groups seeking revenge against fascist leaders and their families. She was arrested by Allied forces and spent nearly 2 years in detention, during which time she was interrogated about her knowledge of fascist crimes and her husband's activities. Her children were also subjected to questioning and social ostracism. Unlike Ida Dalser, Rachele survived the collapse of fascism and lived for another 34 years after her husband's death. However, Her survival came at an enormous cost. She spent the remainder of her life defending Mussolini's memory while struggling with poverty and social isolation. Former allies abandoned the family, and Rachele found herself working as a restaurateur to support herself and her remaining children. In her later years, Rachele wrote memoirs defending her husband and their life together. She consistently portrayed herself as a victim of circumstances beyond her control, while maintaining that Mussolini had been fundamentally good man led astray by others. These writings revealed a woman who never fully understood or accepted the true nature of the regime she had helped legitimize through her role as the dictator's wife. But even as Rachele struggled to rebuild her life after fascism's fall, another woman's story was reaching its tragic conclusion alongside Mussolini himself. Clara Petacci, known as Claretta, entered Mussolini's life in 1932, when she was just 20 years old and he was 49. The daughter of a well-connected Roman physician, Claretta possessed youth, beauty, and an education that made her far different from either Ida or Rachele. Her relationship with Mussolini would prove to be the most passionate and ultimately the most fatal of all his romantic entanglements. Claretta first encountered Mussolini as a teenager, when she wrote him fan letters expressing her admiration for his leadership. When they finally met in person, the attraction was immediate and intense. Despite being married to her husband Riccardo Federici, Claretta began an affair with Mussolini that would dominate both their lives for the next 13 years. Unlike his relationship with Rachele, which was based on domestic stability, or his early relationship with Ida, which was rooted in shared political ambitions, Mussolini's connection to Claretta was purely emotional and physical. She represented youth and passion at a time when he was entering middle age and facing increasing political pressures. Claretta's devotion to Mussolini bordered on worship. She kept detailed diaries documenting their relationship, recording their conversations, their intimate moments, and her thoughts about their future together. These diaries would later provide historians with an unprecedented glimpse into the personal life of a dictator and the psychology of a woman completely consumed by her love for a powerful man. The relationship presented numerous challenges for both parties. Claretta's prominent family initially opposed the affair, understanding the social and political dangers it represented. However, her obsession with Mussolini eventually overcame all other considerations, including her marriage and her family's reputation. For Mussolini, Claretta represented both passion and political liability. While he clearly found their relationship deeply satisfying on a personal level, he was always aware that it could be used against him by his enemies. The Catholic Church, with which he had carefully cultivated a relationship, would hardly approve of such a public affair, nor would it align with the family values his regime promoted. Despite these complications, Claretta's influence over Mussolini grew throughout the 1930s and early 1940s. She had access to him that few others enjoyed, and she used this position to intercede on behalf of various individuals seeking favors or clemency. Her diaries reveal that she often discussed political matters with Mussolini, and even attempted to influence his decisions on certain issues. As World War II progressed and Mussolini's position became increasingly precarious, Claretta's devotion never wavered. While other supporters abandoned him and even his own family members expressed doubts about his leadership, Claretta remained absolutely loyal. She refused to consider leaving Italy or ending their relationship, even as the dangers mounted. When Mussolini was arrested in 1943, Claretta was devastated. She made numerous attempts to contact him and even tried to visit him in prison. When he was rescued by German forces and installed as the head of the Italian Social Republic, she immediately joined him, despite knowing that this decision likely meant sharing his ultimate fate. During the final phase of Mussolini's career, Claretta remained by his side in northern Italy. She lived with him in various locations, continuing their relationship even as his empire crumbled around them. Her presence provided him with emotional support during what would prove to be the final months of his life. As Allied forces closed in and Mussolini's remaining supporters fled, Claretta faced a choice that would define her legacy. She could have escaped to safety, as many others did, or she could remain with the man she loved, knowing that capture would likely mean death. Without hesitation, she chose to stay. In April 1945, as Mussolini attempted to flee to Switzerland, Claretta accompanied him. They were captured by Italian partisans near Lake Como on April 27, 1945. Even in captivity, Claretta refused opportunities to save herself. When offered the chance to walk away, she declared her intention to remain with Mussolini, regardless of the consequences. On April 28, 1945, both Mussolini and Clara Petacci were executed by partisan forces. Claretta's final words, as recorded by witnesses, expressed her continued love for Mussolini and her willingness to die rather than live without him. She was 33 years old, having spent more than a third of her life devoted entirely to a man who had brought destruction to millions. After their executions, both bodies were transported to Milan, where they were hung upside down in a public square for crowds to see. The spectacle represented the final humiliation, not just for Mussolini, but for a woman whose only crime had been loving him completely. Claretta's family later retrieved her body and provided her with a proper burial, though the shame of her association with fascism would haunt them for decades. The stories of Ida Dalser, Rachele Guidi, and Clara Petacci reveal a disturbing pattern in how absolute power affects personal relationships. Each woman represented a different phase of Mussolini's life and political evolution, yet all suffered devastating consequences for their association with him. Ida Dalser's fate was perhaps the most tragic because it demonstrated how a fascist state could systematically destroy individuals who posed inconvenient truths. Her treatment in psychiatric institutions represented not just personal betrayal, but the use of state power to silence opposition and rewrite history. The fact that her son suffered the same fate shows how this destruction extended to the next generation. Rachele Guidi's experience illustrates the isolation and eventual abandonment faced by those who built their entire identities around supporting a dictator. Despite her loyalty and her role in legitimizing Mussolini's regime through their marriage and family, she found herself alone and struggling after his fall. Her decades of defending his memory suggest a woman who never fully came to terms with the true nature of the man she had married. Clara Petacci's story demonstrates the ultimate cost of unconditional devotion to a political leader. Her willingness to die rather than abandon Mussolini represents both tragic loyalty and a form of political delusion that cost her everything, including her life. These three women's experiences also reveal how dictatorships affect not just public life, but the most intimate aspects of human existence. Mussolini's treatment of the women in his life reflected the same patterns of manipulation, abandonment, and destruction that characterized his political career. Their suffering serves as a reminder that the personal is indeed political, and that the cost of supporting authoritarian leadership extends far beyond the ballot box. The systematic erasure of Ida Dalser from official records, the marginalization of Rachele after Mussolini's death, and the execution of Clara Petacci all demonstrate how women associated with failed dictatorships become casualties, not just of political change, but of the very movements they supported or were connected to through love or marriage. Their stories also highlight the particular vulnerabilities faced by women in relationships with powerful men. Each woman sacrificed aspects of her own identity and independence for her connection to Mussolini, and each paid a price that far exceeded any benefits they may have received from his position. Today, these three women are remembered primarily as footnotes to Mussolini's biography, rather than as individuals whose lives had value independent of their relationships with him. This reflects a broader historical tendency to minimize the experiences of women connected to political figures, particularly when those figures are condemned by history. However, their stories offer crucial insights into how authoritarian movements affect not just societies and institutions, but the most intimate aspects of human relationships, and reveal patterns of behavior that extend far beyond the specific context of Italian fascism. The decades-long effort to recover and understand these women's experiences represents an important shift in historical scholarship toward recognizing the personal costs of political extremism and acknowledging that the private sphere is never truly separate from political power. For much of the 20th century, historians focus primarily on political and military aspects of fascism, while largely ignoring the private suffering of individuals caught in its web, treating personal relationships as irrelevant to understanding how dictatorships function and maintain power. This academic blindness was not accidental, but reflected broader assumptions about what constituted legitimate historical inquiry and what kinds of evidence deserve scholarly attention. The experiences of women, particularly those connected to controversial figures, were dismissed as personal drama rather than recognized as crucial evidence about the nature of authoritarian rule. The gradual uncovering of these women's stories has revealed how thoroughly dictatorships penetrate every aspect of human existence and how personal relationships become instruments of political control. The methodological challenges faced by historians attempting to recover these stories illustrate the sophisticated ways that authoritarian regimes attempt to control historical memory. Traditional archival research proved inadequate because official records had been systematically falsified or destroyed. Historians had to develop new techniques for cross-referencing fragmentary evidence, interviewing elderly witnesses who had remained silent for decades, and analyzing the psychological motivations behind conflicting accounts of the same events. Ida Dalser's story remained largely unknown until the 1990s, when researchers began uncovering documents that revealed the extent of her persecution by the fascist state. The discovery process required painstaking detective work that involved searching through psychiatric hospital records, legal documents, and witness testimonies that had been scattered across various institutions throughout Italy. Her treatment by the fascist state has become a symbol of how authoritarian regimes deal with inconvenient truths and unwanted witnesses to the personal failures of their leaders. The breakthrough in understanding Ida's story came when researchers realized that the regime's own bureaucratic obsessions had created multiple paper trails that proved impossible to eliminate completely. Hospital transfer records, medication logs, and even laundry receipts provided evidence of her movement between institutions and the conditions of her confinement. More importantly, the discovery of coded references in government correspondence revealed that her persecution had been coordinated at the highest levels of the fascist state. The systematic effort to erase Ida from history was so thorough that it took decades for researchers to piece together basic facts about her life and relationship with Mussolini. Hospital records had been falsified to make her appear more mentally unstable than she actually was. Legal documents supporting her claims about marriage had been destroyed or misfiled, and potential witnesses had been intimidated into silence through threats to their own families and livelihoods. This level of institutional coordination reveals how extensively the fascist state was willing to go to protect Mussolini's image and eliminate challenges to his authority. The technological capabilities available to researchers in the 1990s allowed for more sophisticated analysis of historical documents than had been possible in earlier decades. Computer databases made it possible to cross-reference thousands of documents quickly, while advances in forensic analysis allowed researchers to detect alterations and falsifications in historical records. These tools revealed the extent to which official histories had been manipulated and provided new methods for recovering suppressed information. The fact that Ida's son was also destroyed shows how political persecution was designed to extend across generations, eliminating not just inconvenient individuals, but entire family lines that might challenge official narratives. This represents a particularly horrific form of collective punishment that targeted families rather than just individuals, ensuring that no future challenges to the regime's version of events could emerge. The deliberate destruction of children reveals the calculating cruelty that lay beneath fascist claims about protecting family values and traditional morality. The international dimensions of Ida's erasure also demonstrate how authoritarian regimes coordinate their efforts to control information across national boundaries. Austrian and Swiss authorities were pressured to deny her citizenship claims and prevent her from seeking refuge abroad, while Vatican officials were convinced to remain silent about her marriage claims, despite having access to relevant documentation. This international conspiracy of silence required extensive diplomatic coordination and reveals how thoroughly fascist influence had penetrated European institutions. Rachele Guidi lived long enough to tell her own story through memoirs and interviews conducted over several decades. But her accounts reveal a woman who never fully understood or acknowledged her role in legitimizing fascism. Her insistence on defending Mussolini's character, even decades after his death and the revelation of his regime's crimes, suggests a form of psychological survival mechanism that prevented her from confronting the full reality of what she had supported through her marriage and public role. The evolution of Rachele's public statements over time provides fascinating insights into how individuals process complicity with authoritarian regimes. In her earliest post-war interviews, she portrayed herself primarily as a victim who had been ignorant of her husband's political activities. As more evidence emerged about fascist crimes, she shifted to defending Mussolini's intentions while criticizing his advisors and subordinates. In her final interviews, she returned to romantic narratives about their personal relationship while avoiding any discussion of political consequences. The psychological damage visible in Rachele's later writings demonstrates how completely dictatorships can corrupt even those who seem to benefit from their association with power. Her inability to acknowledge the reality of fascist crimes while simultaneously claiming to be a victim herself represents a cognitive dissonance that many supporters of authoritarian regimes experience when confronted with the consequences of their support. This psychological splitting allows individuals to maintain positive self-images while avoiding responsibility for their complicity in destructive political movements. Rachele's decades of poverty and social isolation after Mussolini's death also reveal how quickly authoritarian movements abandon their supporters once they are no longer useful. Despite her 30 years of loyalty and her crucial role in providing legitimacy to the regime through her marriage and public appearances, she received no protection or support from former fascist allies when the movement collapsed. This pattern of abandonment repeats throughout history as authoritarian movements discard individuals who are no longer politically valuable, regardless of their previous service or sacrifice. The contrast between Rachele's wartime privileges and her post-war struggles illustrates the illusory nature of benefits provided by authoritarian regimes. Her comfortable lifestyle during the fascist years was entirely dependent on her husband's political position and could be withdrawn instantly when that position was lost. This dependency made her particularly vulnerable to abandonment and exploitation, demonstrating how authoritarian systems create artificial dependencies that serve the regime's interests rather than providing genuine security for supporters. Clara Petacci's diaries, discovered and published years after her death, provide an intimate portrait of life with a dictator that historians had never before possessed. However, they also reveal a woman so completely consumed by her relationship that she lost all perspective on the broader consequences of fascism and her role in supporting it. Her writings show no awareness of the suffering caused by Mussolini's regime, or any consideration of the moral implications of her association with him, suggesting a level of willful blindness that extended beyond mere political naivety. The diaries span 13 years and include over 3,000 pages of detailed entries that document not only her relationship with Mussolini, but also her observations about Italian politics, society, and culture during the fascist period. However, these observations are filtered entirely through her emotional obsession with Mussolini, creating a distorted perspective that reveals more about the psychology of political fanaticism than about objective historical reality. The psychological profile that emerges from Clara's diaries has become a case study in the dangers of romantic obsession with powerful figures, and has influenced academic research into the psychology of political cults and authoritarian movements. Her complete surrender of independent judgment and moral reasoning to her emotional attachment to Mussolini represents an extreme example of how personal relationships with authoritarian leaders can corrupt individual conscience and moral clarity. Modern research into trauma bonding and Stockholm Syndrome has provided new frameworks for understanding Clara's psychological attachment to Mussolini. Her diaries document classic symptoms of these conditions, including idealization of her abuser, self-blame for relationship problems, and inability to recognize the harmful nature of the relationship. These psychological patterns help explain how intelligent, educated individuals can become completely dependent on destructive relationships with powerful figures. Her willingness to die for Mussolini has been interpreted both as tragic loyalty and as evidence of the psychological damage caused by relationships with narcissistic leaders. Modern psychological research into trauma bonding and codependency has provided new frameworks for understanding how intelligent, educated individuals can become so completely attached to destructive relationships that they lose all capacity for independent decision-making and moral reasoning. The publication of Clara's diaries also raised important questions about the ethics of historical research and the boundaries between public interest and personal privacy. Some scholars argued that the intimate details revealed in the diaries were irrelevant to understanding fascism and represented an invasion of privacy that served no legitimate historical purpose. Others maintained that the psychological insights provided by the diaries were crucial for understanding how authoritarian movements recruit and maintain support from educated elites. The scholarly debates surrounding these women's stories reflect broader changes in historical methodology and the expansion of what historians consider relevant evidence for understanding political movements. The inclusion of personal relationships, domestic arrangements, and emotional attachments in historical analysis represents a significant departure from traditional approaches that focused exclusively on formal political institutions and public policy decisions. The experiences of these three women offer important lessons about the personal costs of political extremism that extend far beyond the specific context of Italian fascism. They demonstrate how authoritarian movements affect not just societies and nations, but individual lives and relationships, creating patterns of manipulation, exploitation, and abandonment that repeat across different cultures and historical periods. Their stories serve as warnings about the price of uncritical devotion to political leaders and the dangers faced by those who become too closely associated with failed regimes. Comparative studies of dictatorships in other countries have revealed similar patterns of personal exploitation and abandonment among the family members and intimate associates of authoritarian leaders. The wives of Stalin, Hitler, Mao, and other dictators experienced varying degrees of isolation, manipulation, and destruction, suggesting that these patterns represent fundamental characteristics of dictatorial behavior rather than unique features of Mussolini's personality or Italian culture. Moreover, their fates illustrate how women have historically been made to bear disproportionate costs for the political actions of the men in their lives, often having little agency in political decisions, but suffering severe consequences when those decisions lead to disaster. Whether through institutional persecution, social ostracism, or execution, all three women paid prices that went far beyond any role they may have had in supporting or opposing fascism, highlighting the gendered nature of political persecution and the particular vulnerabilities faced by women in authoritarian societies. The feminist scholarship that emerged in the 1970s and 1980s provided new analytical frameworks for understanding these women's experiences as examples of broader patterns of gender inequality and male domination. These analyses revealed how patriarchal structures within authoritarian movements create particular opportunities for the exploitation of women, while simultaneously denying them the agency necessary to protect themselves from that exploitation. Their stories remind us that behind every political movement are real people whose lives are forever altered by the decisions of leaders and the consequences of historical change. Understanding their experiences helps us comprehend not just the mechanics of political power, but the human cost of the choices made by those who wield it, and the ways that political decisions cascade through society to affect even the most private aspects of human existence. The recovery of these women's stories has also contributed to ongoing debates about historical memory and the politics of commemoration. Questions about how to remember these women as victims, collaborators, or complex individuals who defy simple categorization reflect broader uncertainties about how societies should deal with uncomfortable aspects of their past, and how to balance acknowledgement of suffering with recognition of complicity and responsibility. The brutal fates of Dalser, Rachele Guidi, and Clara Petacci represent more than just personal tragedies. They reveal how political power corrupts even the most intimate human relationships. Each woman trusted Benito Mussolini with her heart, her future, and in some cases, her life. All three paid devastating prices that extended far beyond anything they could have anticipated. Dalser's systematic destruction in psychiatric institutions shows how authoritarian regimes eliminate inconvenient truths through institutional violence. Her persecution reveals that fascism was murderous from its earliest days, and that no individual was safe from state violence if they posed even minor threats to official narratives. The thoroughness of her erasure from history demonstrates the sophisticated methods dictatorships use to control not just contemporary discourse, but historical memory itself. Rachele Guidi's decades of struggle after Mussolini's fall demonstrate the isolation faced by those who build their entire identity around supporting a dictator. Despite 30 years of loyalty, she found herself completely abandoned when the regime collapsed. Her inability to acknowledge fascist crimes while claiming victimhood reveals how completely dictatorships corrupt moral reasoning, making it impossible to distinguish between genuine persecution and the natural consequences of supporting criminal regimes. Clara Petacci's execution alongside Mussolini reveals the ultimate cost of unconditional devotion to political power. Her willingness to die rather than abandon him represents both tragic loyalty and political delusion that destroyed her capacity for independent judgment. Her story demonstrates that education and social privilege provide no protection against the psychological manipulation exercised by skilled authoritarian leaders. The patterns visible across these relationships: initial attraction to power, followed by increasing demands for loyalty, escalation of control, and finally abandonment or destruction, appear to be common features of dictatorial behavior. These experiences reveal how gender inequality creates particular opportunities for exploitation, as each woman sacrificed aspects of her identity for connection to Mussolini, only to discover their emotional investment would never be reciprocated or protected. Today, as new forms of authoritarianism emerge worldwide, these fates remain painfully relevant. They remind us to examine how leaders treat those closest to them, for in personal relationships we often find the truest measure of character and the clearest preview of how they will treat their people. The tragedy of Ida, Rachele, and Clara is that they discovered too late. There is no such thing as a private life with a public monster. Their sacrifices echo through history, as a warning that the price of supporting authoritarianism is always higher than anyone anticipates, extending far beyond the grave and affecting generations yet unborn. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.